Welcome food fans, picky eaters, the flavor curious, and everyone in between. Nothing makes good food better than good conversation. And your table is ready. Come right this way to the Food for Thoughtcast with your host, Melissa Reagan. But you can call her Chef. All right, let's get this episode started.
Hey there, food fans. Welcome back to the Food for Thoughtcast with me, your host, Melissa Reagan. You can call me Chef. Today's episode is episode 16. It's Coming to Terms Part 2. If you listened last week, we were talking all about menu terms, and this week we're talking about cooking terms. So just to get started, I don't know if you've ever been intimidated by a recipe before, or maybe you've read through a recipe before you were going to make it for the first time. And there were terms that maybe you didn't know what they meant. Or there were terms that were so commonly used, you may have thought you knew what they meant. Maybe today we can shed some light on things we're unfamiliar with, things that seem daunting, and just provide a general reference for the cooking words that we should know how to use, when to use them. I'm going to kind of go in alphabetical order here. I want to talk first about the word al dente. So al dente, you've heard it refer to pasta before. In Italian, of course, this means to the tooth. And what they're talking about here is that in pasta cookery, typically Americans will like their pasta just a little bit softer, or that is to say, cooked longer. But when we're talking about pasta cookery and the proper way to cook pasta, we have to talk about the Italian way, because that's where most modern day pasta comes from, is that tradition. So in Italian, when they say al dente, they mean when the pasta is cooked to just firm. In reality, unless you're cooking the noodles or the pasta or whatever it may be and eating it plain directly afterward, you are going to add that pasta to some kind of sauce. So you want to cook it until it's just firm, because if the sauce is warm or hot, the pasta will continue cooking after you add it. And that's why you don't want to cook it all the way, because it's going to cook a little bit more by virtue of the heat, the transfer of that heat from the sauce or the condiment. Baking. This one seems fairly self-explanatory. There is a small caveat here. When you bake foods, you are cooking them with dry heat. So when you hear chefs talk about dry and moist cooking methods, or dry and wet applications in cooking, this is a dry heat application, is baking. Going to use an oven for this. The difference, and that little caveat that I'm referring to, is the fact that you can really bake a cookie, cake, brownies, or a casserole, but we call that same process roasting when it involves meat, poultry, or vegetables. So technically, when you see baked chicken written somewhere, it's really a misnomer and it's kind of misleading, because when we're using dry heat to cook meat, poultry, or vegetables in an oven, it's actually called roasting. And also, roasted chicken just sounds more appetizing, to be honest. Grilling. Grilling means to cook food on, a roast or a spit over coals or propane or gas. We're going in alphabetical order here. The term that I have written down is barbecue. Let's really get that straight once and for all. Barbecue is the food. It doesn't mean the verb in this case, barbecuing. Grilling, cooking out, that's what we're talking about. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're making barbecue. So it could be hamburgers, hot dogs, regular chicken. Completely different, two different methods here. Basting, while we're in the B's, to baste is to moisten food while it's cooking in order to keep it from drying out. So you might have seen, read, or heard, or even done so yourself about basting turkey on Thanksgiving. Now, whether or not this is necessary is kind of up for debate. There are two different schools of thought when it comes to basting your turkey. Is it really necessary? I don't think so. If you cook the turkey the breast side down, I feel like it will baste itself while the fat runs from top to bottom. You can like kind of let gravity take its course, and it's less work for you. So you can watch more football or drink more cold beverages, watch that Macy's Day Parade, without making so many trips to the oven. The other school of thought is basting foods that maybe don't have that fat or the natural juices in them. For example, a ham can really, really dry out unless you've coated that cooking surface in a glaze or something sticky. You've moistened it some other way. But yes, basting and using a baster, that's what we're talking about there. When you hear things or see in print that something is cut on a bias, that just means that the food is cut at an angle, usually 45 degrees. So sometimes this is done so that things look fancy or nice or different. It just gives a little bit variation about how the food looks. But sometimes there's a little science that you can apply to this. So that being that when you cut something on a bias, you've increased the surface area of the food. So you can A, speed up the cooking time, or B, let's say you're making canapes for a party. That is to say 1 to 2 bite a piece appetizers or some sort of first course that you're going to pass around or have on a display. And you're using baguettes as the base. If you cut them on the bias, not only will you decrease the amount of cooking time because you've increased the surface area of the top of this baguette, you've cut it at an angle. Not only are you going to decrease the cooking time, but you're going to increase the interesting factor of this food because it's not just a round little coin of a baguette or piece of bread. Now it has some definition, a different shape to it. Maybe it looks more appealing. Blanching. Blanching is the process where we place fruits or vegetables into boiling water. I hope salted boiling water, because this is another stage of the game where you can add a little extra flavor, right? We do this for a short amount of time, usually 30 seconds or less. Think about green beans or asparagus. Usually the food is quickly moved to ice water because this stops the cooking. So that process is known as shocking. So we're blanching fruits or vegetables. Now, when I'm talking about fruit, a really common example is most stone fruit, in order to peel easier, if you're going to preserve peaches, for example, that would be a time where you're putting fruit into boiling water for 30 seconds or less. Also, we know that botanically, tomatoes are actually considered a fruit. And in the way that we cook them, we treat them more like a vegetable. But that's also another example of a fruit that you can blanch 30 seconds or less in extremely high heat boiling water. When you say it's a rolling boil, it's not just a simmer. So rolling boil, it's reached 212 degrees. This is when the bubbles start to break on the surface of the water. I know this sounds really silly, but a lot of people don't understand the how or why of a lot of cooking methods and recipe words. So that's what this episode is all about, right? This will help you remove the skin easier on tomatoes and peaches, for example. Asparagus and green beans, sometimes even leafy greens, are blanched for just a few seconds. Probably not the entire 30 seconds, but what this does is it gets it ready for the next method of cooking that you're going to use. For example, you would blanch asparagus to make it a little bit, not really fork tender, but it's a stage and a step that needs to happen between the raw stage and roasting, or maybe deep frying, or maybe sauteing. So that's when you would use a blanch. Boil, of course, is to cook something in water that's reached 212 degrees. That is the boiling point of water. So pasta, potatoes, greens, etc., etc., etc. Braise. So to braise something means to cook meat or vegetables first by browning and then by gently simmering in a small amount of liquid in a covered pan until really tender. It doesn't have to be a lid necessarily, but it could be a combination of plastic wrap and foil or just foil. When we bread something, it means we're going to coat it with crumbs or cornmeal before we do the next step of the process, which would be to place something in the oven or to deep fry it. So if you're breading something, that's what that means. I like to talk about brine or brining, which is one of my all-time favorite methods for introducing flavor and moisture to a cut of meat. So there's a wet brine when a meat is soaked in a saltwater solution. Not only are you introducing flavors ahead of time into something like a turkey or a pork loin, or even whole chickens, or any part of the chicken beforehand by using the saltwater solution, but typically the salt and sugar levels in that water solution means that it's going to cross the membrane of the meat. Through that osmosis, you're introducing the seasoning into that protein, but also you are putting liquid into that flesh that's going to make a more moist end product. There's also a dry brine. This is where you rub salt directly onto meat. The best example for this is gravlax, or the shortened term for this, lox. That's the Yiddish word for salmon. So what that means is that you have dry brined salmon in 50% portions, in 50% proportions of salt and sugar. The purpose of a dry brine is much different than a wet brine. A dry brine is going to pull liquid out of meat and concentrate the flavor, not just on the outside, but throughout. The dry brine is typically a longer process than a wet brine is. I'll include some recipes for my favorite wet brine and wet brining methods on foodforthoughtcast.com/blog. Broil. Broil is to cook directly over or under high heat, usually in an oven. A broiler itself. In a commercial setting, we'll have a broiler or a salamander. But in your home oven, you're either going to use the broil function and have a drawer at the bottom of the oven, or you're going to use the broil function and have the radiant heat coming from the top. Typically, there's a couple of sources of heat in an oven. It just depends on what year your oven was made, whether it's gas or electric. Browning foods. In the very first episode of the Food Thoughtcast, we talked about the Maillard reaction and how we introduce that brown caramelization. We're cooking the carbon and the sugars on the outside of food to seal in flavors, to seal in moisture, perhaps. When you're browning something, you're going to cook it over high heat. It's usually on the stove, right, in order to brown the outside of the food. When you see perhaps a thin pork chop at the grocery store and it says it's a butterfly chop, this means that they've just cut through this piece of meat directly in the center, but without cutting it completely in half, and then spread out each side so that it kind of looks like a butterfly or the two wings of a butterfly. You'll see this in shrimp as well. You'll see it on menus and in recipes. When you're butterflying a shrimp, you've cut it directly down the center. If the tail is facing you and the head is pointing down, you've sliced this directly down the center without cutting through the middle, and spread both sides of that shrimp meat open. To clean it and devein it, which is basically where you get the poop out of the shrimp. Sorry to use such harsh words, but that's the reality of what we're doing, and nobody wants to eat a poop chute from a shrimp, so here we are. You can take that butterfly shrimp and fill it with really tasty filling, maybe a breadcrumb-based stuffing similar to what you would put in stuffed mushrooms, or my favorite way is a little bit of Monterey Jack cheese and a sliver of jalapeno and a sliver of bacon, and then wrap it or bread it on the outside. When we're talking about caramelizing or caramelization, this just means that we're cooking sugar until it becomes brown, different stages, different colors of brown, but hopefully not black, or you have a smell in your kitchen that you'll never be able to get rid of, and maybe you'll ruin your favorite pan. Ask me how I know. When you caramelize sugar until it turns brown, it releases a deep, nutty flavor, and it also tastes like caramel in the end product. So an example of this would be if you're making flan or creme brulee. In a creme brulee, you're using a blowtorch to caramelize sugar on top, or you're using a broiler. Meringue, what you're doing is you're caramelizing the sugar that's present in meringue on top of a pie. Savory applications, oftentimes you see this being used to refer to the cooking process that we use for onions. So for onions, you would caramelize them in any situation where you want to bring the natural sugars out, or you need to use the color for your end dish. So French onion soup, for example, you have to take a long time to caramelize the onions low and slow so that they literally color the broth with that brown color at the end. They color the broth that's in the French onion soup, but also they take on this amazing, nutty, sugary, sweet flavor. Maybe you've seen the word chiffonade. That's Chifffonade. Literally, this refers to knife cuts that end up like thin ribbon-like strands. Most often you see this for spinach and basil. Of course, we have the word chop while we're in the C's. This just means to cut food into smaller pieces. The word cream, it doesn't just refer to heavy cream or cream cheese, but here it's being used as a verb. For example, if you have a 2-stage type baking recipe, which would be like cookies or cake, when you cream the butter and sugar together with a hand mixer or a stand mixer, your trusty KitchenAid, even by hand, you're mixing these two items together until there's no longer two separate ingredients. I know this sounds really self-explanatory and simple, but the process for this and the science is really complex. The mixture needs to turn pale yellow and fluffy because what you're doing is you're forcing the sugar granules to be completely enveloped in the fat so that the two items don't separate from each other when you bake the finished product. Deglaze or deglazing. This is referring to loosening all the brown stuck on bits from a pan by adding liquid and then scraping all the bits off of the pan. Now, the French would call all those tasty bits stuck to the bottom of the pan fond, which is where we get the term fondue from, because they would take wine or very strong cider and they would add it to the pan while it was still hot. They would scrape all those tasty bits away. They would add something for flavoring, maybe onions, sherry, chives, whatever the application was, whatever the flavor they were going for was, a little bit of cheese, and then your end product fondue, of course, super popular, had its heyday in the 70s and has since made a resurgence because it's really fun for entertaining. And let's face it, it's just pretty darn tasty. Deglazing, that's you're loosening the brown bits from the pan by adding liquid. So in an everyday application or even a more traditional application for us at home, it could be something as simple as you have browned or caramelized the outside, right, of a couple of chicken breasts in the pan, removed them, you've added onions, celery, and carrots to that pan, and then you've added like a little white wine or chicken broth or red wine to loosen up all the bits and get the flavor into those vegetables. You add the chicken back to the pan, and then you've covered it and allowed it to braise, right? Every stage, every word that we're talking about here is another chance to add flavor, and it's often additional and progressive steps in the same recipe, right? Dicing. Dice is just to cut food into very small cubes. There are all different sizes of dices. There is a brunoise, which is 1/8 of an inch by 1/8. There's a small dice, which is 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 inch. There is medium, which is 1/2 inch, and then large, which is 1 inch, but it's cubes specifically. So when you're dicing something, you are dicing it into cubes. Double boiler or bain-marie. So double boiler means that you are putting a bowl, balancing a bowl on top of a pot of boiling water on a stove. You might have done this to cook custard, pudding, pie filling. Frequently, it's used as a method for melting chocolate on the stovetop so that you don't burn it. Use a double boiler to literally separate the heat source from the food that you're cooking with it. For example, if you have a bowl and you're melting chocolate chips on top of the stove, you're doing so on top of the pot of boiling water because the steam is considered a more gentle heat method and it won't burn the chocolate as easily. Whereas if you had the chocolate in the pan right next to the heat source, whether it was gas or electric, you would not only cook it too fast, but then you're going to run the risk of burning it. And I don't know if you ever smelt burnt chocolate, but it's just an experience that you don't forget. Dredging. To dredge means to coat uncooked food, usually with flour, cornmeal, or breadcrumbs. The difference between this and breading is not much, but I'll just say that when you're breading something, usually just patting it into one or all sides. When you're dredging something, you want it completely submersed. Two examples of this, right? If you are just breading the outside of, let's say, a piece of chicken or a pork chop with a little bit of breadcrumbs, just to get one side or just to create a crust on one or maybe the top and bottom parts of that item, that's what breading is going to be. Now that's the verb. The noun, the breading of something, would actually be the end product of a dredge. I know it sounds really confusing, but when we're talking about dredging something in flour, cornmeal, or breadcrumbs, we're talking about completely submersing it. And the best example that I can think of for this is good old shake and bake. If you're using shake and bake from the store and you're shaking the food in the bag and all that coating is around all sides of the food, that's a really good example of dredging, even though using the bag method, which works amazing for fried chicken as well. A Dutch oven is a thick-walled pot with a tight-fitting lid, so you might have seen these made by Le Creuset. I personally prefer my enamel cast iron Amazon Basics. It is a tiny fraction of the price of Le Creuset, which I feel exists solely based on the popularity of the brand and keeping that brand recognition going. The Dutch oven can be used on the stove top and in the oven. A lot of times it goes from the top of the stove into the oven. Cast iron Dutch ovens can also be used for in the ground cooking applications. Like when you're camping, you can heap hot coals in and around on top of a Dutch oven that you've buried in the embers. And you can use it for braises, stews, soups, sauces, pot roast, and for things like on a camping trip, baking biscuits, chicken pot pie, or even baking cookies. The term emulsify, when you emulsify, you're creating an emulsion. One of the best examples of this is vinegar and oil together to form salad dressing. This could be using a whisk, a blender, or just shaking two items together. So when you're talking about making an emulsion, which would be like a vinaigrette, for example, the term literally means to combine two ingredients together, which normally would not mix, right? So oil and vinegar is a prime example of that. Some things you can never emulsify together. Oil and water is a really good example, but oil and vinegar is a good example of an emulsion. Usually you have to have some other ingredient with the oil and vinegar to help emulsify. Some common emulsifiers are mustard and garlic and egg yolks. The best example of this usage is Caesar dressing. Fold or folding. This is when you combine lighter ingredients with heavier ingredients using a gentle over-under motion, or literally you're folding one part over the other. The best example I can think of for this is when you are folding whipped cream or beaten egg whites into the rest of a cake batter, or maybe even a mousse base for pudding or pie filling or sponge cake, or angel food cake is a really good example. You're just going to fold literally over and under with usually a rubber spatula. You don't want to use a whisk for this, because if you use a whisk, you'll deflate the mixture, because you can't lift anything over and under with a whisk. Those tines are made to break things down. Whisk we use to emulsify. You can whip air into other foods with the whisk. That would be the lighter ingredient, but the heavier ingredient, most likely you've used like a hand mixer or a spoon or a fork or something a little bit more aggressive. And so You would never want to use a whisk to fold something. Rubber spatula or a large spoon is going to be the best application for that. Into the G's, garnish. Garnish is our first G word for recipe terms, cooking terms. A garnish is just a decoration that you put on food or drink. Sometimes it has a purpose, sometimes it doesn't. In my universe, I would like for every garnish to be edible and serve a purpose. I don't just want like a parsley sprig on the side of a plate because it's ridiculous and there's no reason for it to be there. Grease. This is both a verb and a noun in cooking, right? When you grease the inside of a cooking dish with fat or oil to prevent sticking, it's the verb. And then, of course, the noun is the grease or fat that is left over as a result of cooking a certain food. Best example, bacon grease. Please don't throw it away. Please use it to cook anything and everything. That leads us to julienne. Julienne is to cut a food into long, thin pieces like matchsticks, for example. So small, long, thin pieces. The French also call batons, which is where baton comes from, right? Like throwing a baton in a drill routine. That's a larger stick. Julienne is the smaller stick size. The julienne and the baton are just the second step of I've sliced this ingredient into a long rectangular piece, and now I'm going to dice it by creating small squares. It's just another step in that process. Sometimes julienne is used in a salad or, more vegetable applications. Whereas if you're dicing something, maybe it's not going to be as prevalent in the end result of the dish. But if you're using a julienne for something, it's usually because you want somebody to see that shape for a reason. Onto the K's, knead. That's Knead. This refers to working a dough like bread or pasta dough, usually with your hands. It's not just smashing things down, although that's a great stress relief if you are making bread. There is a science to this. You're stretching and folding and pushing and pulling the dough. The reason is because you want to develop the gluten. The gluten is, in regular baked goods like bread dough, right? Or like pastries. The gluten is that support structure that adds the chewiness to the final product. So you're creating those pathways and those layers of gluten. It's the protein, right, that gives bread its chewiness and helps it stand up, and rice, it helps it stand up to the cooking process, and it helps it form that structure in the final shape. So you want to stretch, fold, push, and pull the dough toward you and away from you. And then leavening. Leavening, again, could be a verb or a noun. This is any agent that you add to a baked good, a dough or a batter to help the food rise. So there's obviously baking soda, which requires an acid in your recipe. Baking powder is heat activated. Yeast, you could use air as a leavener. So using air as a leavener would be, for example, whipping air into egg whites to help them puff up. You could also use eggs as a leavening agent sometimes, but most commonly you're going to be seeing baking soda, baking powder, and yeast, whether that's yeast that you bought or wild yeast from the air, like a sourdough starter, for example. Marinate. Marinade and marinate are kind of used interchangeably. To marinate something is just to place it into a flavored liquid in order to transfer the flavor to that food. Marinade is the liquid itself. Mince. A mince is another knife technique where you're cutting a food up into similarly shaped, relatively uniform, extremely small pieces. This is even smaller than a dice. So to the naked eye, at the end of this process, once you've minced something, you're not going to be able to see small cubes with any discernible measurement. It's just smaller than a dice or a chop, right? Parboil, very similar to blanching. It's to partially cook by boiling. So they've taken the words and put them together. Partially boiled, parboiled. Usually you're doing this as a first step. I probably use this method most often in potatoes for au gratin or scallop potatoes. I parboil them until they're not quite soft enough to be mashed potatoes. Let them cool just a little bit. Maybe grate them to make potato pancakes or latkes, or let them cool a little bit, peel them, slice them for au gratin or layered applications like scalloped potatoes. We talk about poaching. When you're poaching, you're cooking a food gently over low heat and barely simmering liquid, and it's just barely covering the food. You don't want to waterlog something. You're not trying to boil it, so the heat has to be low enough to where it's not simmering, which is 180, or not boiling, which is 212 degrees. But when you're poaching something, it's a very gentle, moist heat cooking method, and you want to preserve the integrity of whatever you're poaching. The best example I can think of for this is when you poach salmon, you don't want it to fall apart at the end, because poaching is really, one of those methods that your end product is highly prized. Like, anybody could boil salmon. That's kind of what happens when you buy canned salmon, is that it's been steam cooked under pressure in the can, and that's why it just kind of looks like a pile of shredded up mess. But if you're going to take the time to poach something, you need to do it at a low enough heat to where it doesn't destroy the product. Proofing, it's a verb. This term has a couple of different definitions. One of the definitions is allowing yeast to combine itself with water until bubbles begin to form. So if you've ever made bread from scratch, one of the first steps is often combining yeast, whether it's fresh yeast or self-rising or instant, with a little warm water to kind of activate it and wake it up, so that it can serve as a useful leavening agent. It also refers to the rest period given to certain dough. So after you've made that bread dough and you have formed it into the shape, whether it's a batard or a baguette or a boule, which is like the large round loaves, or maybe you have formed a rectangular loaf of sandwich bread, etc., that's considered a first or second proof. So that would be kind of quasi-noun and verb. Puree means to mash or blend food until it has become a liquid. So some examples of this would be like a cream of potato soup, maybe cream of asparagus soup, maybe the potatoes themselves that you've called it a puree instead of a mash or a smash or whipped. Classic example of pureed food is applesauce. It usually requires cooking beforehand. Reconstituting or rehydrating is when you introduce moisture back to a dried food by soaking it typically in warm water. So a really good example of this is like if you bought sun-dried tomatoes and you wanted to plump them up for a recipe, you would add a little warm water and let them sit. Raisins, you can also do the same thing there. Also dried cranberries. Reduction, or to reduce, just means to thicken a liquid or a sauce by boiling in order to concentrate the flavor. So what you're doing when you reduce a sauce or a liquid in cooking is you're bringing it slightly underneath a full rolling boil, because you want to cook the water out of it and reduce the sugar or prevalent flavors in that liquid. Gravy, for example, you might use a different thickening method initially for gravy, but you can also let it cook down just a little bit to concentrate the flavors. Rendering is to cook the fat out of meat or poultry over a low heat. So in this application, if you're trying to render the fat out of bacon because you want to save the grease, or it's also known as the drippings, right? If you want to save that, you don't want to cook the meat or poultry on too high a heat because A, you don't want to burn it. B, it kind of takes a long time to coax all the fat out of those tissues. It's kind of like, like you have to get the meat to relax so that it releases all the fat out of those tissues. Remember, it's a network, right? When we talked about in the steak episode, it's a network of pathways of the flavor fat and the other fat, that marbling and the outer fat. Those two fats are two different textures, two different thicknesses, and they're going to render at two different speeds. So one of the best examples is when you're trying to make bacon bits, for lack of a better term, but the French call these lardons. If you were making crispy pieces of bacon to go on top of a salad or in a stuffing, or maybe just to go in your mouth, which is my favorite way, Let it cool first or you'll end up burning your tongue. Just ask me how I know. But yeah, if you're rendering bacon to make it crispy, low and slow is the way to go. You have to allow that water time to evaporate, and you have to allow the fat time to come out. Rind. The rind is the thick outer layer of fruit, and mostly this refers to citrus fruits, orange, lemons, and limes, for example. So when you see the term zest, it's when you're removing little bits of the rind, but you don't want to go down into the pith, which refers to the white part of those fruits, because if you zest too far or peel too far down into the pith is what holds all the bitterness in oranges, lemons, limes, and grapefruits. The rind can also be the outside of cheese. So think brie, camembert, and parmesan. These wheels of cheese have this rind on the outside. A lot of times it's the end product of the way that the cheese was made or seasoned. Can you eat the rind on brie and camembert? I mean, yes, it won't kill you, but it's also not the most fun thing to digest. And to me, I think the texture is just abhorrent. I would rather not have to deal with it. Now, there are other uses for rind, such as you can take the rind from Parmesan wheel and put it in your spaghetti sauce as a flavoring, so you don't have to waste it after you grated or sliced all that cheese. And then additionally, we talk about rind when we refer to things like the rind from a watermelon, which is completely edible. In Asian applications, they boil this and make sweets with it. It can be cooked down for different teas. And then, of course, watermelon rind pickles. Big delicacy for those in the know. In the R words, roasting, we're back to that. So that's cooking meat, poultry, or vegetables uncovered using the dry heat method in an oven. It can also refer to cooking vegetables coated in a small amount of oil or fat at a high dry heat. So basically talking about the same thing, but just remember we bake cookies when we roast chicken. That's what you need to know. A roux, we talked about this way back on episode 1 when everybody was just getting to know me. If you've been around since then, thank you so much once again for listening. A roux is flour and fat that has been cooked together either at the beginning or the end of a recipe to form the paste, which will thicken a sauce or a soup. Saute, one of my absolute favorite cooking methods because of its speed, and to me, it's easy cleanup as well. This just means to cook food in a small amount of fat over relatively high heat. So on the stovetop, this is going to be medium to high heat. Saute from the French word to jump. So if you've ever placed a drop of water into a hot skillet to see whether it was hot enough to maybe pan sear something or pan fry something, you've seen how the water dances and jumps out of the pan. That's exactly what this word is referring to. Scald. Scalding is not just the temperature of water or what happens when you burn yourself, hopefully not, but when we're talking about scalding in the context of cooking, it just means to heat liquid almost short of boiling, so less than 212 degrees. The best example I can think about this is when a recipe asks you to scald milk. Little bubbles form around the edge, but it hasn't boiled yet. It's really easy to burn milk when you're scalding it, so you have to really keep an eye on it. You can't turn your back on it. But yes, little bubbles forming around the edge of the liquid, but it has not boiled, which means there's no large bubbles breaking the surface. Sear, which I referred to in a couple of the terms as a descriptor. A couple of the previous terms on this list, I used this word to describe the other words. So when we're talking about searing, we just talk about browning the surface of meat specifically with a quick cook over high heat so that the juices are sealed in. If you heard the stakes are high, the episode about steaks and steak cookery, you know that this is kind of a myth, and the verdict is still out as to whether or not it actually seals juices in because of the way that muscle fibers and those pathways of meat and fat are actually created when we cut steaks themselves out of larger pieces of meat. So whether or not it actually seals the juices in, it's up to you. But when we talk about searing, you're literally just browning the surface of meat. It's a very quick cooking method. Usually it's just to get color on both sides. Score. When you score something in cooking, it means to make shallow cuts in the surface of a meat or a dough. So, for example, on a baguette, you have little lines across the top where not only steam is escaping, but you can make pretty designs. That's a really good example there. When you score the surface of a meat, for example, this could be like the diamond cuts that you see in a really traditional ham. Maybe there's cloves there for decoration, but the outside has been scored. A really prevalent cultural example of this, right, would be if you bought a spiral sliced ham, they've had to score the outside to kind of get it off the bone. This could be done for purely decorative reasons, but also you can score meats and fish to allow marinades to soak in, or for fat to drain off or out during cooking. Simmer, a word that I've used to also describe other terms, elaborate about other terms on this huge list of recipe terms we're talking about on today's episode. A simmer is just to cook in liquid that is just below boiling. So not to be confused with scalding. It's all about context, right? And what a recipe is asking you to do. But a simmer could be a noun or a verb. So bringing, it's kind of a state of being for water. If the water is simmering, you've brought it to a simmer. But it's also simmering. So don't get too confused. It's just not boiling is what you need to understand. The bubbles form on the surface, but they don't burst. It's going to be in that 180-degree range. Skewer. To skewer or a skewer? That is the question, right? So a skewer can be a thin wooden bamboo skewer or a metal shaft, like if you've ever had kofta or if you've ever ordered shawarma and it's on a huge metal skewer, or if you've ever had kebabs on a grill or made kebabs at home, you kind of have a couple of choices, right? You have the shorter 6-inch bamboo skewers, which are really good for vegetable applications. And then you have the metal or stainless skewers that are better for meat. You just need something stronger because it's going to be on the grill for longer. Obviously, meat's going to take longer to cook than vegetables. So when you skewer something like chicken satay, for example, and you're having to weave it in and out of a chicken breast or a chicken tenderloin, that's the verb. And then the noun, of course, is whatever type of stick you're using. It could even be a toothpick, right? If you're serving some fancy, maybe caprese salad skewers, or you're serving some antipasta skewers, it could even be a toothpick or like a knotted bamboo pick if you're serving it as an appetizer at a party. Skim. Skim could refer to skim milk, which has a certain amount of fat. Also, it's terrible, and I just don't understand why anybody would drink or use it for anything. And I said what I said. But when you're talking about this in the context of a recipe and what it's asking you to do, when you're skimming something, it's like you're removing foam or fat or kind of grime from the top surface of a cooking liquid. You might have heard this word used in at-home aquaculture where you had to skim algae off the top of water. It's really no different than skimming the scum and foam off of the top of homemade chicken stock, for example. A slurry, we talked about this in episode 1. Once again, if you've been here since the beginning, I can't tell you how grateful I am. The slurry is a mixture of starch, cornstarch, flour, arrowroot, or potato starch and cold water that you whisk together and then use to thicken soups or sauces. Great example of this is going to be orange chicken. Very prevalent use of a slurry. Spatchcock is a fantastic word. I love this word. Spatchcock means to split poultry by removing the backbone so you can flatten it out. What this does is it makes it faster for you to cook an entire chicken, for example, and it makes the skin crispier on the finished product. Steam, obviously, also noun and a verb. To steam is to cook food on a rack or in a steamer. So they make bamboo steamers, they make stainless steel steamers that you set over a pot of boiling water. So for example, if you're steaming vegetables or maybe like bao buns or dumplings, and then you can also steam on a rack for the same purpose, right? Over a boiling pot of water. The important part of this is that the food doesn't touch the water. And the water, by definition, for steaming should be boiling or 212 degrees, because if the water is simmering and the food is touching it, then you're technically poaching, right? It could also be steam itself is the evaporative process that happens when you boil water. So that's the noun part. When you're cooking steam off, or that's kind of where we get that figure of speech, right? To blow off steam, or maybe you're using a pressure cooker and you have a steam release valve. Those are all the ways that you'll see that in reference to cooking. To steep is to soak coffee, tea, or herbs in hot or boiling water so that the liquid takes on the flavor of the food that's being soaked. You can steep coffee, ground coffee, you can steep it overnight, starting with hot water to make, like a very rudimentary coffee that you could reheat. Now, cold brew coffee would not be considered a steep or to have been steeped, because by definition you need hot or boiling water. So cold brew is a process all its own, but you see this, most often when you're making yourself a cup of tea. You're allowing a tea bag or loose tea that you've put in an infuser to steep. Stew, once again, this is one that could be a noun or a verb. So this is to cook food covered and over a low heat in liquid. This would be not a boil and not a full-on simmer. So if you were stewing something, the best example I can think of is when you buy canned stewed tomatoes. They are cooked in this way. It's very much in that 170s range over low, gentle heat in liquid, which in that case is the liquid that comes from the tomatoes itself. Sometimes also wine or fortified wines for flavor. But also a stew is considered a hearty soup. But the method version of that word came before, right? What we know as like beef stew. Stir fry is to quickly cook small pieces of food over a high heat. So that's different from searing, because you're talking about the size of the food. Usually you do this in a wok because that is going to allow the heat, so it has more surface area, right? So when you're using a wok, that's going to allow the heat to transfer more quickly to the food. And you're going to use a small amount of fat or liquid because you don't want the food to steam itself. And if you use too much fat, then you're actually pan frying. This is stir frying, and you also stir constantly, in case you couldn't tell by the use of the word stir in the original term. A stock is a strained liquid that's the result of cooking vegetables, herbs, meat, or fish in water over a low heat for hours. Usually you use a stock as a base for other things like soups, stews, and sauces. Technically, a stock is going to be meat and bones, and a broth is going to be just meat. And a fish stock is sometimes referred to as a fish fumet. And this can also refer to the method itself and the finished product. To tenderize is to prepare meat in such a way that it will make it more tender. There is meat tenderizer, which is a chemical spice blend. I don't want you to think about chemical in a bad way here. It's not really the connotation. It's more the context or how you're going to use it, right? So meat tenderizer is prepared with papain and different enzymes, and these are naturally found kind of like bromelain in pineapple and papaya. Those naturally occurring compounds and enzymes in the fruit have just been extracted, dried, and powdered so that you can use it to tenderize meat. Also, this could be a physical act of pounding meat if you're making chicken fried steak, chicken paillard, if you're making pinwheels, if you're piercing the meat somehow or marinating it is also considered tenderizing. And then the word truss, Truss, this is the act of tying whole poultry with strings to make sure it cooks evenly. So the best example of why you would truss something is to keep everything in place while you're cooking it. Heat makes things expand, so you truss chicken and other poultry to keep it together so that it stays contracted, right, while you're cooking it. Whip, WHIP, not just Cool Whip, which I greatly love and I will fight you about it. I don't care what your opinion is. I think it's delicious. I also like regular whipped cream and the stuff from the can. I'm an equal opportunity whipped cream fanatic. Doesn't really matter where it comes from to me, but in cooking context and in recipes, whip, WHIP, means to beat food with a whisk or mixer in order to incorporate air. Remember, we talked about how air can be a leavener. So you can accomplish this with a wire whisk, also known sometimes as a piano whip, because it looks like piano wires, the same thickness. Or you can use a mixer, whether or not you use the whisk attachment or the regular mixing attachments or the paddle, doesn't change it. You're still whipping the food. Zest, we talked about this when we talked about rind and pith earlier, but it's the outer colored part of the peel of citrus fruit. So remember, if you're looking at orange, yellow, lighter orange, for grapefruits, tangerines, whatever you're using, or green, as in the case of limes, if you're looking at those colors, that's great. And all of that is flavor. When you reach the white, you're really running the risk of hitting all the bitter stuff, which is the pith. The last term I want to talk about is confit. You might have seen this, CONFIT, in a recipe. For example, duck confit. So this is a fancy French word that means with fat, and it really refers to the process of cooking something in its own fat. So duck confit is duck pieces, whatever is being specifically used for the recipe, right? It could be legs, could be thighs, could be duck breast, or could be the entire duck that has been submerged in duck fat. So more fat used as the method by which, that duck is like slowly cooked until it's tender and amazing. But it can also be used in applications where the thing that you're cooking, confit, doesn't have its own fat. One of the best examples of this is garlic confit. So garlic confit is usually garlic cloves that are slow cooked in some kind of fat, which you could do like confitception. You could cook garlic cloves in bacon grease, which would be amazing. But one of the most traditional ways to do this is just with olive oil or some sort of olive oil and vegetable oil blend. And if you lean more towards coconut oil or grapeseed or avocado, those are also perfectly acceptable uses. Confit is used when you want to cook something slowly to allow it to release its own flavors, but you might be using the fat that you cook it in afterwards for other applications. So after you cook garlic confit, for example, you'll have garlic oil, which makes amazing croutons, just in case you were interested. Don't forget about our June promotion. For the entire month of June, please, please, please just consider how you might feel led to help food scarcity and fight hunger wherever you live. There are tons of places that you can donate to in whatever city you live in that you can help locally. All you have to do is screenshot a picture of your donation, send it to us either in our messages on Instagram at Food for Thoughtcast, Facebook at The Food for Thoughtcast, or you can email it to us at foodforthoughtcmc@gmail.com. The person who donates the highest, I will match that donation here in Dallas for the North Texas Food Bank. You'll also receive a box of the Food for Thoughtcast swag. Not only that, but other goodies as well. But the main prize being a signed copy of Get Your Grub On, which is a cookbook by a friend of the show and frequent guest, Chef Steven Gonzalez. And I hope that this encourages the listeners to take action right where they are. This is just a fun little contest. This isn't meant to guilt anybody. If you don't have the means, please consider donating your time. I think it's just as valuable at the end of the day as your money is. But yes, please remember, edit out your banking information. All I need is your name and an amount. This is all through the month of June, so you have plenty of time to consider how and where you can donate. Don't forget to look on foodforthoughtcast.com/blog. There's a link there that's titled Take It to the Bank Where You Live, to Feeding America's resources for everywhere that you can donate in each state in the United States. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. I hope that you're inspired to look at recipes with fresh eyes. I hope this has cleared up any misconceptions that you have and made you excited to dive into some terms that you've never seen, or maybe try a new recipe that you've never tried before. Once you let us know how it goes, please reach out. We love interacting with the listeners on the socials and the website and via email. You are what makes this show great. That's a wrap for today. Until the next episode of the Food for Thoughtcast, make good food, eat good food, share it, and be kind to one another.
Thanks so much for listening today. You are part of what makes us special, and we are so glad you joined us. Don't forget to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. Just like food, delicious podcasts are better when you share them with others. Come back for seconds wherever podcasts are served, and we'll catch you in the next episode of the Food for Thoughtcast.
You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at the Food for Thoughtcast or at www.foodforthoughtcast.com, where you can link to all podcast players, or you can send us an email at foodforthoughtcmc@gmail.com.